On the 15th of August 1945, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito gave a speech on the radio in which he announced the unconditional surrender of Japan to the Allied powers. Among many nationalistic Japanese, this dual-voice broadcast caused quite the uproar. Seppuku, ritual suicide, was ingrained in Japanese culture as an honourable course of action. Following Japan's surrender, hundreds of higher and lower-ranking Japanese officers and soldiers took their own lives in one final act of patriotism to the empire. A more novel way of sacrificing oneself for the empire was kamikaze, a tactic that was only officially endorsed in October 1944 after the dire situation of Japan's war effort became clear to the Japanese people and army. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had the dubious title of Father of the Kamikaze, as he was the creator of the tactic, took his own life through ritual suicide the day after the dual-voice broadcast was aired. In a letter he left, he apologized for the approximately 4,000 young men he had sent off to die in kamikaze attacks. On the Japanese mainland, commanders disarmed their soldiers and removed the propellers from aircraft to prevent anyone from using them in an illegitimate kamikaze attack. Yet, on Kyushu, Japan's southernmost island, there was a commander on an airbase that listened to the broadcast and did not consider disarming his troops or removing propellers. In fact, he did quite the opposite. The news of Japan's unconditional surrender reached an admiral of the Japanese Fifth Air Fleet, Admiral Matome Ugaki. Now, we actually know Admiral Ugaki very well because he wrote an extensive set of diaries during the war which reveals both personal motives, emotions, and the general war mindset. That day, Ugaki wrote that due to the static on the radio, he could not correctly hear the emperor, but could guess most of what was being said. "I've never been so ashamed of myself," was his closing sentence that day. Already before the surrender, Ugaki had decided he himself would not give himself up, but embark on one final kamikaze mission. He wanted to ram enemy vessels at Okinawa. Now, officially, Ugaki had not received a ceasefire order, so he figured he was not guilty of insubordination. That afternoon, Ugaki stripped himself of any military rank, epaulettes, and his medals, leaving him with a regular dark green uniform. The only item he kept was the short sword that was given to him by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, one of his former superiors. He then drank a toast with his staff, who took a photograph of him in front of a bomber that was going to be used as a kamikaze aircraft. The photo you're seeing right now was taken moments before Ugaki and his crew took off on their mission. At the airfield, 11 Yokosuka D4Y Susei dive bombers stood ready for the unit. There certainly was some conflict within Ugaki's squadron, by the way. To begin with, every aircraft required a crew of 2 men, and although Ugaki asked for just 5 planes, meaning 9 other men would join him on his mission, the 11 aircraft meant most of his staff would embark with him on their suicide mission. Although it is a bit unclear why, the officer whose kamikaze position Ugaki took climbed into the aircraft with Ugaki and the radio controller. As such, there were 3 men in his aircraft that usually took 2. The other 20 men wearing rising sun headbands stood at the ready and shouted their confirmation when Ugaki asked them if they were ready to join him. An eyewitness account survives of a pilot that couldn't join the mission because of a tuberculosis infection. He later reminisced that when Ugaki saluted the crowd and he sat in his kamikaze aircraft, 4 pilots refused to return the salute. They were convinced if he wished to sacrifice himself, Ugaki should do so on his own instead of taking 22 other young men with him. The planes departed on their way to Okinawa as the day came to an end. Within too long, 3 aircraft returned with supposed engine trouble. The other 8 seem to have continued. And here we get on a bit of speculatory ground, because there have not been very concrete records about what happened next. What is certain is that at 7:24 p.m. Ugaki sent his last message, in which he said he was going to ram into the arrogant American ships and would display the real spirit of a Japanese warrior, the Emperor, Banzai. Now, there are some conflicting reports. One source states that a bit before 8 p.m. the crewmen of the USS LST-926, located at Okinawa, were unloading their ships and drinking beers when they heard aircraft engines. They only realized they were enemy aircraft when they opened fire from afar, and the soldiers immediately ran to their anti-aircraft guns and started firing. The thing is, there was no official report written about this. The earliest official document after Ugaki must have carried out his attack is from the next day, registered by the crew of the USS LST-96. The morning after Ugaki's attack, they discovered smoldering remains of the cockpit on the beach with 3 bodies inside. Considering the statement given by pilots that were left behind was that there were 3 men in Ugaki's aircraft, it is very likely that one of the bodies was Ugaki. They were burned beyond recognition, and one of the bodies wore a dark green uniform. A short sword was found nearby, but his head was crushed, and several limbs were missing. It is very likely and commonly accepted this body must have been Ugaki's. Now, the bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the sand on the beach, and not thought of again. There were no official reports of a successful kamikaze attack, and as such, it is very likely that all 8 aircraft were shot out of the sky before they could ram themselves into US targets. What is for sure is that Ugaki was the last Japanese kamikaze pilot, together with his staff, to attempt to carry out a kamikaze attack. Now, if you're interested in more stories about kamikaze pilots, there will be some end cards on screen about both the story of the first Japanese kamikaze pilot and the incredibly tragic story of First Lieutenant Hajime Fuji, a man whose family sacrificed themselves so he would not be held back in performing his perceived duty of carrying out a kamikaze attack. Thank you for watching this video. I would also like to thank all my patrons for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and want to support my work, consider checking me out on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you will already gain access to the exclusive Patreon series. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.